Hi, James. Thanks so much for making time with me. I appreciate this interview and this opportunity to talk because you and I go back actually a number of years. It's weird for me to think that back in my early days of journalism, you were one of the first people I met, one of the first I interviewed back in Portland, Oregon in was it 2017 or 2018 that the grievance papers scandal story came out?
That was in 18, yeah. It's been a while.
Yeah, I remember you, Helen, Peter Boghossian interviewed you in a room with Peter's dogs, and those were the days. A lot has changed in this movement. I guess at that time that was kind of pre-IDW, early IDW. I mean, that whole entire thing's fallen apart. But, your profile has grown significantly. People are obviously familiar with your works on explaining critical race theory. I think you are probably one of the very few people I could count on probably one hand in the United States who helped mainstream and distill a lot of these really complicated far left academic theories for a wider audience to be able to better understand. So and now you started for a while now new discourses, and anyways, I've been a fan of your work for a long time. A lot of the people watching this will be fans as well. And unfortunately, very recently, you were permanently suspended from Twitter. And I wanted to talk to you about that. You were very unapologetic in using groomer, using the term groomer to refer to people who were ideologically grooming children and the public into a certain political ideology. Were you the one who actually coined like that in this particular context?
So I want to be as fair and honest as possible. I have been informed with evidence provided that it had been used by other people before I started doing it, but I thought that I had begun it. I did not know other people were doing it, and I started doing it on Twitter, and I probably am the person who popularized it. Radical feminists apparently had been doing it in their forums and sometimes in public-facing accounts to go after trans activists as well for a period of time before that. But so I can't claim that I was the first person to ever do it, but I think I can claim credibly that I was the one who popularized it and kind of drove it into the mainstream.
So in that very long introduction I just did, I also forgot to mention that you're a PhD holder in mathematics. You've written a book on critical race theory. So you've done a hell of a lot in just a few years. But I'm trying to map out like how you got from, because when I knew you actually in 2017, 18, 19, you were so unapologetically left-wing and so anti-Trump. And now I think a significant portion of your supporters that I see online are conservative, Christian, Trump supporters. How did these two worlds and your previous views, I don't know if you still hold on to those views actually, like how do you get from there to here is what I'm asking.
Well, if I might paraphrase the great Thomas Sowell, facts. As it turns out, the left has been going, as you know as well as anybody, or better in some ways than most people, the left has gone off the cliff. I don't know that I am technically conservative. I get identified that way a lot now. My views, however,
you get
of
called
the
far
left
right.
and of what enables the left. Oh, I know. I got told the Human Rights Campaign put out a thing recently saying that I use alt-right terminology like cultural Marxism, which is just a term that's been used for over 100 years. So how it's alt-right terminology now is a mystery to me. But anyway, watching through 2019 and 2020, when in a sense woke stopped being fun and just this stupid but dangerous thing that was happening primarily in academia and kind of in some of these, circles in journalism, and it turning into something that had gripped the culture completely, and then studying its its antecedents and its kind of trajectory into the public led me to completely reject that and completely reject everything that enables it. And so it's funny you bring up that a lot of my followers and friends and supporters are Trump supporters. I frequently remind them that I think I'm more MAGA than they are. I am not in the sense of being all that enamored with Trump personally one way or another, but in the idea of a make America great again, to renew America back to a constitutional republic as opposed to something that's undergoing a communist revolution. I'm probably more committed to that cause than the majority of my conservative supporters are. So maybe that's why they call me far right. I don't know. My views are still fairly moderate on most points, except to deal with the inclusion of what boils down to communism in a new form in the United States, which I feel unambiguously has no place here, and I want to see it completely removed, except as a matter of private belief that people are entitled to have under the Constitution.
So explain what you mean when you're talking about communist revolution, because I'm in the space of researching and writing about communist ideologues, militants, and particularly the anarchist communist manifestation in Antifa. And I see a lot of times with Republican politicians at their political events, they will throw around these terms like Marxist, socialists, Democrats, communists, and kind of use it as if they were all synonyms. I know they're doing it for political reasons, political partisan reasons. I think it's inaccurate, but describing what's happening now on the mainstream left as a communist revolution is pretty strong. Can you clarify? And because when I think of communist revolution, let's say my family background of parents who lived through a communist revolution in the form of a collapse of an entire regime of South Vietnam, the dissolution of their country, and the literal imprisonment, prison camps of anybody who's affiliated with the former government. That was the reason for the huge diaspora and refugee crisis out of Vietnam after the end of the Vietnam War in 1975. So I think of it kind of more in that terms, and it sounds hyperbolic when you're describing America now as in the midst of communist revolution, but I don't want to misstate your words, or maybe I'm not understanding it.
No, I would understand why you would see it as hyperbolic, but I see that that's because the conditions under regimes like we saw arise in Vietnam or in Korea before that, or in China before that, or in the Eastern Bloc before that, or in Russia before that. So these kinds of models of communist revolutions, those were very 20th century in terms of their technology and implementation. We're not in the 20th century anymore. China has spent the last 25 years developing and enabling and implementing a social credit system. They've spent the last, several decades developing a mass surveillance system, so that if we were to dip into the fancy terminology of the postmodernists, what Michel Foucault called the carceral continuum, they're on a very kind of high-tech surveillance-based, exclusion-based through social credit means of carceral behavior. They don't have to take people and lock them up in prisons at gunpoint or re-educate them in gulags any longer. They can do so through what they're using for the re-education is nudge theory to the general public through social media, through media propaganda, which is what we call the left media. They can do so with children through educational devices like social and emotional learning that present them with social and emotional conflict and then give them correct resolution to that in line with doctrine, which is a form of programming that models or mirrors, I should say, what Mao was doing in his prisons for his re-education prisons. So we're seeing it in a new 21st century context, enabled by these little black mirrors that we carry around in our pockets that create a different set of constraints and means for population control. But I don't think that it's ideologically that much different. Of course, by definition, Marxism being a critical dialectical philosophy has to destroy itself and reinvent itself with each new generation. So you see Marxism as a classical form going into vanguard Marxism with Lenin, going into cultural Marxism, going into critical Marxism, going into this kind of utopian woke Marxism that they have now starting about 20 years ago, now shifting into this new form of the sustainability development goals or the Sustainable Development Goals of the United Nations and the ESG component, where they're creating a social credit system to control the way that corporations behave and to control the way that institutions have to behave, and thus use those as instruments to nudge, if you will, or to start to contour the way that people are going to live. We don't need a breadline, for example, if we have a social credit system that says you can't buy XYZ until your social credit score is high enough. So they can force you to participate in different ways than at the barrel of a gun in this kind of new program. And I think that that's what we've been unambiguously going through. And just for the unambiguous part, since George Floyd died and they took to the streets in 2020, is that the Cultural Revolution had come to America. And I'm proud to have actually warned people who worked for the Pentagon in February of 2020 that this was coming about 3 months in advance. I'm sad to say that they didn't listen to me. But I do believe that we are going through a cultural revolution that is a soft, almost velvet style revolution, or a color revolution, as it were, as opposed to a kind of overt militaristic coup like you would have seen with the Bolsheviks or with the communists in China taking over for the Kuomintang or whatever. So when I say that we're going through a communist revolution, I mean that quite literally, but communism itself has evolved from the crude communism or cruder Soviet-style communism into this new hybrid model that's been pioneered in China since we opened up the market there. And so they have a communist structure with a market operating inside of it, and at its pleasure. And that model is being, I think, brought more global now.
Is it still communism without the economic framework of classic, I guess, communist theory and ideology?
So this is an interesting question, and I'm glad you asked it. Communism actually precedes Marx. The economic communism that Marx was kind of looking at was something that was already well developed. It mostly was viewed as a small-scale solution. We have actually a commune here in Tennessee, rather famously. It's called The Farm, that's been in operation for over 100 years. It's not exactly a resort of high health and prosperity, but it's been ongoing for 200 or some odd people for generations now. But in the broader context, when you look at Marxism, I have stepped away from kind of the classical interpretation of Marxism and the academic understanding of Marxism, that Marxism is primarily offering an economic theory. And I think that Marx actually laid down a theology, that he organized a religion, and that material conditions were the driving center of what he thought made for man's sense of being and purpose in life. And so he built a religion, and the kind of operating system that he plugged into it was economic conditions. So an economic theory got built into a religion that was an underlying theology. And that, I think, is something like, kind of like it sounds a little silly, but like a PlayStation. A PlayStation isn't any of the games that it plays. It has the capacity to change the game out. So Marxism would be like, or the PlayStation. And then, what we call classical Marxism would be a particular game, but then you can take that disc out and put a different disc in. And when you put the new disc in, I know this is old, they don't use discs anymore, but bear with me. Cultural conditions, or like the kind of collective terms of society that's critical Marxism, or some identity politics like critical race theory or queer theory. Or post-colonial theory, then what you have the same engine, you have the same PlayStation running the game. It's just operating playing a different piece of software. So I see Marxism that way, and I see all of these on this, and this has been the bulk of my work for the past 2 to 3 years, is seeing all of these movements, whether it's critical theory, whether it's cultural Marxism, whether it's postmodernism even, which is a change from when I wrote Cynical Theories, whether it's this woke stuff, the identity politics, critical race theory, queer theory, post-colonial, all of the different fat studies, all these things, I see them on the exact same continuum, and it's the exact same engine with a different, if you switch metaphors to a car, it's the exact same engine with a different body style, in essence. So yeah, I still think this is, we could, if we need to nitpick, we could call it neo-communism, because it's introduced the idea of a market to solve the production problem, and it's introducing the idea of technology to solve the distribution problem. But it's ultimately still the same goal, that all the people have to be on the same page, that as they say it in this one book called The Politics of Education, that the I think is fulfilled in the we think. And so it's still a collectivist, redistribution-based idea to where we're supposed to generate a ultimately classless and stateless society in the long end of time. With an administered state, I should say, in between, because that's what socialism represents for Marx.
What about for the Democrats and liberals who are on board with the far left agenda, sort of in the form of they support or help lead or amplify these cancel campaigns, or trying to implement policies wherever to restrict freedom of expression? When you look at these particular liberals, they're not communists. I'm thinking there are a lot of liberals, let's say in Western Europe, who are supportive of restrictions on speech that they think is hateful. And a lot of many American Democrats wish they could emulate that type of legislation in the U.S. were it not for the First Amendment. Do you find those type of people fitting into this communist revolution in a way? Are they like, what's the relationship, would you say, with these neo-communists?
I don't know that I don't think they know that they're communists. Now, before I get into that, I want to remind you, and you would probably have encountered this, a famous character kind of in this progression is this woman, Angela Davis, very radical, left-wing black activist, black feminist. And she's still active today in the prison abolition and police abolition movement and in education. So she's still alive, she's still active, she's still revered and cited by the far left and by even kind of the mainstream left now, these Democrats, some of them you mentioned, as like she's some kind of hero. And she was the vice presidential candidate for the Communist Party USA a few times, at least twice. I don't remember if it was more than twice in the 1970s. And she eventually left the Communist Party because she said that it was too right-wing. So when we start talking about communism again, as we come out into from 20th century into 21st century, there's been kind of a sea change in how they think. But as far as these kind of people who you would identify as say that they want to have hate speech campaign, or prohibitions and so on. But they certainly, if you ask them, or do you identify as communist, do you subscribe to communist policies or ideas, they would say no. They probably have some socialist ideas in terms of, maybe, socialist medicine or government medicine or even government education, something like this. But they don't view themselves anywhere on the communist spectrum. But what I would say is that what we're doing is, we're just misunderstanding what Karl Marx actually did, which was that he built a theology. And if you build a theology, then when you have a religion that builds itself out of that theology, you have lots of people. First of all, you have several denominations that'll come out of it through different interpretations of the underlying central scripture. But then you'll also have lots of people who definitely would either identify, say, as Christian, but they don't really, that maybe they've never read their Bible, they don't have the slightest idea what's in it. They know a few Bible verses maybe that they heard at church, but they certainly are not theologically savvy. They're certainly not, they're not even really theologically aware. They think it's what it means to be a good person. And you have other people who would buy into a lot of these kind of things without necessarily even calling themselves Christian. Especially there in Western Europe, you'll run into that quite a lot. But that they're still operating within a broadly Christian framework, or that they identify as Christian without knowing the first thing about what Christianity is really about, except for maybe the one first thing, about Christ, doesn't change the fact that they're still operating within that underlying theological structure, that their worldview is still organized in terms of that, and that they might still be, upholding a system that is in essence built out of that and perpetuating that. So I think these Democrats that don't realize that they're playing the part of communism and wouldn't identify that way have subscribed to enough of the theology to be moving the goals of the communists, but just like the communists have always said, the people in the Communist Party used to laugh. They had things they called sucker lists, which were influential people, usually progressive religious people, who they could trick into doing communist agenda items or holding or promoting beliefs useful to achieving a communist agenda item without actually identifying themselves as communist at all, and even sometimes identifying themselves as against it. And they call them also useful idiots, which is a term that most people have heard, and they laughed about it. And so I think that these people may not identify as or realize that they are participating in a broad communist revolution, but they're intricately necessary components to achieving exactly that revolution. Communism has always been and always will be something very, very few people actually support and understand at the same time. But it requires getting a lot of people to take up policy points and things on its behalf in order to get them passed in the initial stages until that final clamp of power comes down. And so I see them within that framework. People say that it's not fair for me to say that, but I think it's just a blunt fact, and it's very dangerous. I hope that they can be awakened to what they're contributing to. Hate speech laws are a communist agenda item. They serve nobody's freedom.
Where does Antifa's anarchist communist ideology fit into this cultural revolution, in your opinion?
I mean, historically speaking, and you know because of your book as well as anybody, you know this is a little bit complicated, but they are in some sense a kind of on the ground shock troop, but they are also wild and anarchist, right? So they have a different model. I don't think that the Antifa is going to be particularly happy with corporations like BlackRock and Vanguard becoming the de facto rulers of the world. And so they are, again, I think Yuri Bezdomov called people like them political prostitutes and said to basically put no energy into them. They just do what they need to get done for you, and then you make use of them. And let's pray for Antifa that they don't get their way, because they're going to get shot. They're going to get locked up. Every one of those criminals is going to be completely worthless to the new regime once the new regime's in place. So the role that they play is there. Now, philosophically, they're not ambiguous. Antifa write in their own books that they, take their inspiration from characters like Frantz Fanon, who had strong Marxist influence. That's a French Algerian post-colonialist in the 50s and 60s. He wrote The Wretched of the Earth in 1962. He advocated violence to throw off colonization and to regain your sense of self. They openly embrace him. They openly embrace Herbert Marcuse. They openly embrace the idea of either a Che Guevara style or a Maoist style cultural revolution, although they may not praise the idea of the guy at the top. And so they are a absolutely crucial paramilitary entity that is strategic enough not to organize, at which point it would have to be cracked down upon beyond kind of networking and undergrounding and kind of a syndicate kind of style. But they are an integral part of making this thing happen. They're not quite the Red Guard. They're more like if we just cut the anti-crap out, which is a lie that they're actually fascist. They're more like Mussolini's black shirts than they are like anybody else. Which, how do they dress? I mean, come on. But they, just like the communists said. So Bella Dodd gave testimony. Dr. Bella Dodd gave testimony in 1953 to the House Un-American Activities Committee. Or House Committee on Un-American Activities, will say it correctly. And she testified as a disaffecting communist about everything that the Communist Party was up to and what it did. And she said explicitly, they take on nice-sounding names for themselves, like anti-fascist, and then position themselves as the only people who are truly against fascism, so that everybody who opposes them, they say, was an anti-fascist. And so by the law of double negatives, it must be a fascist. And it's this kind of, I don't know, idiotic Manichaean kind of thinking that characterizes their entire movement. And so there's the part of me that's, human and, gets pissed off, that seriously hopes that the communists get their revolution, that Klaus Schwab or whoever else gets what they want, and every one of these motherfuckers goes to prison. or gets killed because they were on the wrong side of history thinking they're on the right side of history. And I would love to be able to watch it because they put those people down before they put down the resistance, as it turns out. But then there's a part of me that's human in another way and sees the bigger picture and really hopes that they don't end up in that fate and that we can turn this thing around before it gets to that point, because it's horrific and nobody deserves that, even these poor, deluded political prostitutes.
What do you think of this is the argument that Antifa and their allies and supporters and fellow travelers say. They say that they have to exist, their militancy needs to exist because the threat of far-right, racist, nationalist, Christo-fascist ideology is everywhere, overwhelming, targets people of color and minorities, and that they need to exist to operate as protectors of these communities because the state being systematically racist and homophobic and, all these other phobias that they list out, that they therefore must organize and do their direct action, which their MO primarily, when it's on the street, is to directly assault and fight and or kill if need their political opponents. And then the whole online world, it's the doxing and research and working with larger institutions, SPLC, etc., working with journalists, passing on information to launder reputation smearing or target. So that's a long question.
Yeah. No, it's fine. First, I'll actually point out that their primary tactic is what's called mid-level violence. It's a form of political violence where you are engaging in a type of provocation that's just like a toe over the line or a foot over the line without going all the way over the line. And they do that specifically because they either want you to back down, in which case they win, or they want you to react, in which case they will film you and make it look like you overreacted so they can create the smear campaign to destroy you and force you to back down or force you to be silenced or move on. It's a very strategic manipulation, and it's called mid-level violence, and it's actually well documented. We're just politically, in terms of political warfare in the United States, we're all fairly ignorant, but Antifa's not. Now, as to their claim that they need to exist, I'll give them some credit. In the 1940s and 50s, when they were coming together, 30s, there was some truth to that. But this is not true any longer. So it's just a BS pretext so they can keep living out Herbert Marcuse's wet dream of refusing the entire society and pretending that we live in a state that he called repressive tolerance, where the right wing, the Christo-fascists, and all of these people are actually recruiting and actively growing, and that these communities actually needed protection. I'm sorry, guys, that died. That's not real. That stopped being real in Western nations a long time ago. I'm not saying that there's no right-wing fanatics. I'm not saying that's true. I'm saying that actually there's no need to protect from them through street militancy any longer. That's a fantasy that's dead at least 40 years. And you can say whatever you want, but if I were going to tell somebody who was a thoughtful person shaking a little bit loose from Antifa and that mentality, what I would tell them is, you, Antifa, are the primary cause of the thing that you claim to be fighting. So you're creating a self-fulfilling prophecy. You're pissing people off to the point where they react against you and they become reactionaries because you're using these mid-level violence provocations that piss people off and don't give them due pathways to recourse. So they're left with, well, if you're going to make me look bad, I'm going to deserve to look bad. And then you have entities like the Proud Boys showing up and being total dickheads. So they are creating the thing that they use to justify their own existence, which in other words is snake oil. The best case that they can make for themselves is a snake oil argument that because what was historically no longer is, and their idea that systems and structures are infinitely self-perpetuating, which is a Marxist belief about how the bourgeoisie rig society and dictate ideologies to keep themselves in power and to exclude certain other voices, is actually just a projection of how Marxists think, which is again why, as political prostitutes, they should really think twice about what they're supporting, because they're not useful to a regime except destabilizing the existing thing. Destabilizers are not useful to a regime that wants to be sustainable. And so they're going to be done away with or locked up or house arrested or put on the most strict forms of social credit limiting that anybody in this society is going to have. And they can whine and cry and piss and moan and try to mid-level violence a regime, a real regime, not a free country that allows them to get away with mid-level violence, and see what happens to them. They wouldn't get away with this shit in China, I'll tell you that right now. The Chinese government, if somebody tried to do what Antifa does in China, would smash their asses so hard, they'd all be in standing room only prisons under Tiananmen Square until they die. That only works in free countries. It only works in the place exactly that is not what they say. So they're selling snake oil. They've deluded themselves, and they're selling snake oil to justify being little assholes. That's my opinion of them.
Shifting gears a bit, so just in my 13 minutes speaking with you, and I knew this beforehand, you are very calm and of course well informed, a great speaker, and yet, if I looked on your social media, on Twitter, I would get this perception that you've been permanently suspended for repeated hate speech. I want to give you the opportunity to sort of, going back to that okay groomer question at the beginning, why in your mind was that a good response to describe the people leading a lot of this brainwashing, and why you viewed, either knowing that when Twitter was being placed under pressure to censor people for using that word, that you, in my understanding, continue with anyways, and paid a pretty heavy price. You've lost access to a big platform. You worked really hard to build up a large audience on there. Obviously, you have other things you're doing as well, but to lose access to that large audience is a big deal, I think.
Yeah, well, so there are two primary reasons why OK Groomer was fantastic. One of those is rhetorical, and one of those is descriptive. The descriptive reason is very simple. They are groomers. They are groomers into an ideology. They are cult groomers. That cult grooming is into topics of sex and sexuality and gender in ways that actually require introducing things like sexual conversations, sexuality conversations, gender conversations, sexual topics, sometimes the viewing of pornography, sometimes questionable materials like the book Genderqueer that have graphic drawings. They're cartoons, but they're still graphic drawings of one teenager performing oral sex on another. Technically not, because it's on a strapped-on sex toy, but whatever you want to make of that, that's there. It's a very graphic book. And so this idea of these things happening, and then, well, we're going to use this as a vehicle to initiate and then promote social transition that we're then going to hide from your parents, and this positioning of the facilitators in the school, whatever they are, teachers, administrators, nurses, social workers, whatever their role, their specific job, they're facilitators. The facilitators of this process, not only advocating hiding this from the parents, but then also pushing it along further and further, actively, again, positioning themselves as the equal and the friend and helper of the students, while they're positioning the parents, for example, as a potential danger. If you have to hide something from your parents, maybe they won't understand you. We have to protect you from them. We have to protect you from your parents. There's no better word for that than grooming. So in a technical, descriptive sense, it's the best word to describe what's actually going on. Now, in a rhetorical sense, and it's not the word groomer, it's the phrase okay groomer, is rhetorically awesome. First of all, it's just dismissive. That you can say it back to anything, and therefore it has like infinite power. We learned that with OK Boomer. Once you introduce, which is the other reason it's rhetorically awesome. I just stole one of their things and reappropriated it back against them, which is awesome. You remember we have that chirpy pretty girl dancing around. OK Boomer, wearing the Bernie shirt. No matter what the boomer says, anybody classified as a boomer, you don't have to answer their argument. You don't have to engage with their argument. OK Boomer, and it's over. There's nothing they can say. It's very dismissive. It's very very powerful rhetorically in that regard. And OK Groomer does the same thing, as if we all should have permission not to listen to somebody who's a groomer about their tortured arguments for why they should be allowed to continue grooming children. And I will say that I don't believe the majority of these people are pedophiles, but if we were to adopt the left's logic about systems and structures, we would say that they're supporting structural pedophilia, because pedophilia is occurring. There are children that are being victimized. They are being victimized by people who are taking them down this path, and thus the entire apparatus of supporting that would be, under their own line of thought, structural pedophilia. That they're engaging in. But we've seen what would happen, Andy, if you were, say, a structural racist. Well, they just drop it. You're a racist. You're supporting racism. So these people are just pedophiles, and they're just supporting pedophilia by their logic, which of course we don't accept. But if we're going to have a double standard where they get to play that game, this OK Groomer thing hits right back into that the other direction. And obviously it proved that they couldn't get the stink hit them, and they could not get the stink off of them. It's like they got sprayed by a skunk and they just could not wash it off. The groomer thing has stuck. They can't get away from the groomer thing. Their attempt to block people like me and now Colin Wright and other people for kind of challenging some of this stuff. Libs of TikTok is under kind of constant threat for this, has been banned permanently from Facebook. Gays Against Groomers got banned permanently for being anti-LGBT. They're literally a 100% gay organization, and they're apparently homophobic now because they were saying groomer. All it's doing is revealing to more and more and more people that there's something to this. I can't tell you. I got probably 1,000 emails or messages, texts or whatever, after I got kicked off of Twitter. And this was just 2 weeks ago. I probably got 1,000 messages of people saying, I thought you were going too far with the groomer thing, and now I believe it completely. Now I believe that that's exactly what they're doing, and they're trying to censor it because they don't want people to see it. And I think it therefore is a virtually perfect term. Now, technically, I will point out, on a very technical level, I did not get kicked off of Twitter for OK Groomer. I got suspended for 12 hours from Twitter, or locked out for 12 hours for OK Groomer, after which I deleted all of my OK Groomer tweets. Every tweet where I called somebody a groomer, I went and deleted them all proactively because I knew they were going to try to target my account with it. And so I deleted them all. What I actually got kicked out of Twitter permanently for was OK Child Sexualization Specialist, which I thought was a clever way to reword the similar idea, but not use the G word. And so I actually believe I got kicked out of Twitter permanently for beating a leftist at a word game, which they don't tolerate very well.
So everything that you're saying, I mean, the side that you're arguing, I think, would win if there was a level playing field in this battle of ideas. But I know that big tech is not fair for making sure that discourse can happen fairly without intervention. They put their weight on the scales, and I mean, you and I saw it happen in real time actually for the activists who mobilized to make sure that those who said or insinuated that compared these ideological extremists who were targeting children to groomers that can no longer be allowed. You saw that happening, and you continue forward. Do you regret not recognizing the rules of the game and working around that?
No, I reject the rules of the game. In fact, I reject the idea that Twitter has political authority. I reject the idea that social media platforms have political authority, and I think they're going to slowly figure it out. I actually believe that what's going to happen right now is that I think the end point of this, and I don't know the legal ramifications or the technical ramifications of this. I think it's complicated. I've talked to some experts about it, about whether or not we should be pushing to have big tech once it crosses a certain size. This apparently Clarence Thomas has talked about articulately, so I know it's already mapped out in law. I'm not the relevant expert on the issue to talk about it in granular detail, but to see these things classified as common carriers, much like telephones are, where they cannot actually regulate the content, but what they could do is give you lots of sliders that you can turn on and off. Like if they want to classify certain things as hate speech or have a hate speech button, you could go in and turn that off, and you don't see those words. You could go on Twitter right now, as a matter of fact, and mute any word you want, including groomer, and never see a single tweet that involves that word. But what I think is going to happen is that it's going to drive the existing social media platforms essentially into death, and they will end up getting them classified as common carriers, because rather than watching themselves die. They will fight for it as their last resort to save themselves, because what's going to happen if Twitter continues down this road or Facebook continue down this road is they're going to continue pushing out all of the interesting people. What makes the social media platform interesting is not having a platform to preach to a choir. It's that there's a dynamic and there's a possibility of reaching a broad audience, not a narrow one. This is why Twitter is more fun than Truth Social or Getter or whatever, which I'm on and active on. You reach a different audience, and it's broader, and there's this perception that you can reach, significant journalists, you can reach politicians, you can interact with, if you're, say you like books, you could interact with the author of the book or whatever, possibly, or the movie. Maybe one day Seth Rogen will come and ask you if you're Jewish, like he did to me, because he was mad at me one day and he was probably high. So you can interact with famous people. There's lots of dynamics that's going on there, and what they're actually doing is killing the dynamic. If there's one thing that I've heard more often than the thing I just told you about, which is I didn't think you were right, and now I do think you were right about the groomer thing, is Twitter is getting increasingly boring, not just because they're not flattering me and saying it's boring without you. Some people are polite enough to say that, or kind enough, but most of the people are saying they're kicking so many people off. Jordan Peterson's is locked out until he deletes something he won't delete. The Babylon Bee is locked out until they delete something they won't delete. Dr. Rollergator is a smaller account, but a hilarious account that is locked out until he deletes something that he won't delete. There's so many of these. And then, we got Megan Murphy's been banned permanently. We've got Gays Against Groomers is banned permanently. There's all these accounts that have been banned permanently, that at some point it's going to hit a tipping point. And I don't think this is like, oh, everybody will move over to Truth Social. I don't think that's true. I think what will happen is that the mainstream will just become disenchanted with and bored with the platforms. They'll remember that there's life outside of them, and they will leave them to the journalists and the politicians and the political activists who are all talking to each other, and nobody else is interested. There's no reason to interact on what feels like a grotesquely unfair playing field. The Twitter became as big as it is because it grew up before it was political. Truth Social struggles, or Getter struggle, because they grew up inherently being de facto political, even though they're open to whoever wants to be on there. They're de facto like the island of misfit toys for Twitter rejects. And so they're not as fun. Well, Twitter will also cease to be fun, and then the mainstream will leave it because what makes it fun will go away from them. Listening to a bunch of activists tell you about the world you're not that sure about is not something most people want to do. Even if they agree, it gets boring because there's no dynamic. There's nothing interesting going on. So they're going to kill themselves. They're going to poison themselves. Twitter will bottom out. I actually, to be completely honest with you, I think that what they're doing right now, everybody says, well, they're on a warpath. They're blocking everybody because, Musk didn't buy Twitter or hasn't bought it yet, and they're just kind of taking revenge for that possibility. And I don't think that's true. I think that they're actually trying to destroy the company from within before Musk gets a hold of it, to try to bottom out its value, to make it toxic and make it die. I actually think they're trying to kill it on purpose. It's possible that they just are completely beholden to a small group of activists who are inconsolable and probably psychopathic, and are just following that lead off of a cliff. But I actually suspect they're trying to destroy it from within, and they'll succeed one way or the other. It's going to die, and in the end, the only thing that can rescue it is to level that playing field again, and to put content moderation in the hands of the users, which would happen by it gaining something akin to, but not exactly the same as, common carrier status like we have for telephones and freight and everything else. We should want that to happen, honestly, in one way or another at least, because we don't want things like freight shipping to lose their common carrier status, where a train line or a trucking company could deny delivery to people based on politics. We actually don't want that. We don't want to live in that world, I promise you. So this common carrier thing should probably go the other direction, and let Twitter and Facebook and all of them figure out how to operate in a business model, or operate a business model that can attract customers in a place where they can't just limit people in that regard. If you can send it on a postcard and you equip users with the ability to censor material that they don't want to see personally, but it can't censor it from the whole platform, then it should be on there. And I think that that's the direction it's all going to end up. But I think they're going to hurt themselves so bad that they're the ones that are going to end up arguing for it to save themselves.
Well, it's nice to hear your optimism. I mean, you explained it well. I I'm terrible at predictions. I'm not going to predict, but I don't generally feel optimistic about, what may ultimately happen with the platform. It almost feels a bit too big to fail. And even if it were to be experiencing failures, that would be masked up by, the media coverage, which would just continue, liberal legacy media coverage, which would praise Twitter for taking actions for removing so-called hate speech and making the platform a safer place. In the meantime, interesting
I just
people
think that people's hearts follow freedom, and if they take the freedom away, it'll they can't force people to be on Twitter, or I guess maybe they could, but they don't force people to be on Twitter. And so if they make Twitter miserable enough, people will leave, and where will they go is the question. But I think that misses it. They'll do what I did. They'll go outside. They'll go find other things to do. They'll read a book. They'll jump on more live streams and talk to people. I have such better. So I had a handful of friends on Twitter that were like genuinely friends, but they were my Twitter friends, right? So I just got all their phone numbers one way or another. It took a little doing for a couple of days. I got all their phone numbers. We actually text each other. We have better relationships now than we did on Twitter. Twitter was almost moderating a relationship or mediating a relationship into a more fake parasocial environment than a real social environment. And so it's actually, I think, a matter of you say too big to fail. Well, they are right now, but that's not a permanent state. And if they keep screwing it up, they could actually dwindle their user base to a point where it doesn't matter if they're too big to fail, because nobody that means anything is there. They could be, just limp along as this kind of like gigantic ghost ship that nobody pays any attention to. And I don't know. I feel like I had cold water thrown in my face, and kind of can see this differently because I'm still involved with the other social media platforms, but I don't see the point of them either. Like getting water thrown on my face by Twitter is like, wow, we're all just pretending this really matters when there are far better ways. Far better ways. The broadcasting does have some advantages, but it doesn't compare to being able to directly text somebody. There is the chance that somebody you don't know will see it, but the old school network effects are really powerful. Like, they think that they can silence me. Do they not realize that I'm text messaging congressmen like most days? Like, they're not silencing me. They're absolutely out of their freaking minds. I've made friends already in the world. I don't need Twitter to maintain those relationships. And when I text message somebody, they listen more than when they see it in a tweet that I just threw out. So, it's a delusion that they're too big to fail. It's a temporary state that doesn't. They're too big to fail for now. But if they screw themselves up badly enough, they won't stay that way.
Okay, last subject I have to ask you about is the Sam Harris controversy. A interview that he did with Konstantin Kisin and Francis Foster on trigonometry last week went ultra viral. I'm really curious what you think on this, because you come from sort of a similar world as Sam Harris.
Around, I have like literally all of his books on the shelf right here next to me. Like,
so you come from I'm just trying to present to the audience that you come from the new atheism world as he did.
That's right. So actually, my relationship with Peter Boghossian started because I wrote an essay defending Sam Harris.
What were you defending about? What's this about the Islamophobia accusations?
Oh my God, probably that. But that was in like 2012, so I don't remember. But I had written an essay defending Sam Harris, and Peter was blown away by how well I had defended Sam Harris. I took Sam Harris as sort of when I was a new atheist, as kind of my huge intellectual mentor. I liked him far more than I liked Richard Dawkins and Christopher Hitchens, but Sam Harris was really the guy I looked up to and wanted to kind of model my patterns of thinking after. And so we can put that on the record as somewhere that I was. And like I said, I met him in person, had a wonderful brief meeting over drinks in a hotel in Portland one evening. 45-minute conversation or something with a few of us there, and it was very nice. It was fun to have that happen.
So in this viral clip, most people have seen it. I'm just going to recap it. The most controversial part is he was quite loose with his words at one point in describing his hatred of the former President Donald Trump, which is already well known and been on record on a number of his podcast episodes years now. He illuminated that hatred by saying that he thought it was warranted for big tech to censor the reporting on Hunter Biden ahead of the election, that really Trump was such a danger and horrendous person that it wouldn't have mattered if Hunter had dead children in his basement. Obviously, that was hyperbole, but the sentiment was essentially, by any means necessary, Trump needed to be prevented from being reelected. Of course, Sam has clarified that he wasn't advocating for election fraud or anything like that, but he stood by his comments, and there was a lot of uproar on the right. And people like myself who were very big fans of him going back many years were quite, I was shocked just because I think it really, if I interpreted his words correctly, he's arguing for the undermining of the cultural norm of freedom of expression. And you need that cultural norm for the legislation to have legitimacy. So, anyways, I asked you for your thoughts. What do you think?
Well, I agree with you. I wish I could say that I was surprised or shocked. And I think I wish I was shocked. But I've watched Sam kind of descend into this this kind of corner with regard to Trump for a long time. Now, it was hyperbole when he mentioned the dead children, but I will remind people that he argued very forcefully in 2016, ahead of the election, when Trump was elected, that he would prefer any random American to be given the office rather than Donald Trump. Any randomly selected American would be a better president than Donald Trump, which I don't think is true. And that's a very risky thing to have said, at any rate. And so his hatred for the guy, but in 2016, I find it somewhat more comprehensible, didn't diminish through the course of Trump's presidency, didn't diminish through the exposure of the many lies that were propagated about Trump, regardless of anything. Because in the interview with Constantine and with Francis, he said specifically that whatever the corruption of Joe Biden, it's nothing. It's a firefly to the sun in comparison to the known corruption of Donald Trump. But it seems to me that Sam Harris doesn't know that many of those stories were false. They're demonstrably false. They have been demonstrated to be false. And whatever corruption remains, the number of lies and misdirections that were spun about Trump is just almost unbelievable. The media at no point ever did it tamp down. And Sam never backed away from this. I think he tweeted earlier in the year, when things started to get quite bad, or some point last year, that he was having to eat every single syllable of his tweet, that he was so glad the adults are back in the room watching the Biden administration. I think that was in the wake of the catastrophe last year in Afghanistan is when he decided he had to tweet that, but I could be mistaken about the circumstances there. So I watched this. This is a complete... This is the final conclusion, the end point of Trump derangement syndrome is what this is. This is the point where a very smart person has had a successful psychological operation done to them that has deranged them to the point where their grasp on reality, as John Baudrillard put it when he was describing hyperreality, that he has actually no contact with reality whatsoever, and no capacity to contact reality on this issue. His lack of moral clarity and political clarity and just kind of common sense, with, as you said, his willingness to undermine the legitimacy of a democratic republic and the way that it forms laws and the way that it executes laws is just mind-boggling. I've wanted to say for years, since I finally read it, I finally get around to reading these critical theorists, and there's this book published. It's the magnum opus of critical theory. It's called The Dialectic of Enlightenment. It's by Max Horkheimer and Theodor Adorno, published in 1944, repackaged and republished in 1947 with significant changes. And that book says that what happens with Enlightenment thinking is that Enlightenment claims to get rid of mythology, but becomes its own mythology, a myth of rationality, of instrumental rationality, as a matter of fact. And I never really fully grasped what that book was about until I watched Sam Harris go crazy. And I was like, oh, Sam Harris is the embodiment of that book's point, is that in fact this kind of cult of rationality that he has kind of embroiled himself into, it left him extraordinarily susceptible to this psychological operation that was terminally effective on him. And I say terminally because I think he is now in a position of being in utter shambles. I kind of giggled. I'm still somehow on his mailing list for his podcast. I signed up for it many years ago and just never hit unsubscribe. So I got another update, I think today or yesterday, in my email, and I just kind of giggled. It's like thinking, oh, you're still putting things out after that. So I think that was those are my thoughts about the issue. I mean, it's sad. I'm not shocked. I've watched The Descent into Madness. I feel as though this is a form of madness that had initially captured me, and I got pulled into its gravitational pull, as you mentioned earlier in the interview, and then I escaped that pull and feel as though I became able to see reality more clearly. And people like Sam Harris hesitated not at all to call me insane as a result, and I hesitate not at all to return.
He called you insane
at this point, where I don't remember if I mean, many people in the orbit did. He certainly insinuated that I had gone off the track because of my support for Trump, and he had followed me on Twitter, and then he had unfollowed me on Twitter and said some quite difficult things about me. I can no longer search to see what he said about me, which I would do and let you know for clarity, because I no longer have a Twitter account. So I can no longer go find that out. But it definitely occurred on Twitter. It wasn't a private conversation. That I was poo-pooed pretty hard by Senpai there. And it was over the Trump issue. I mean, I'm blatantly like the world's leading conspiracy theorist now after Alex Jones. I've actually heard that I'm considered that way. And it's funny because, like Alex, my conspiracies come from reading the books of the people whom we would call conspirators and saying, well, this is what they said. And then people say that's a conspiracy theory.
Well, James, I originally told you this interview would be short, 15, 20 minutes, and I'm taking an hour. And I thank you for how generous you've been with your time. You're fascinating, and so many things I want to ask you about. And I think, for people who maybe have only seen you on social media, they really should be consuming your video work and your written work, because there's so much intellectual depth to your views and your ideas that you're not able to obviously say in a short tweet. And what are the places where you would like to direct people to read more of your work or watch?
Yeah, if you want to keep up with that, I have a podcast that's called the New Discourses Podcast. It has a kind of subsidiary in it that's called New Discourses Bullets, and so that will tell you that the bullets are short. The New Discourses Podcast itself sometimes is as little as half an hour, but sometimes exceeds 4 hours per episode. And people who want to know, I record them in a single sitting, in a single take, and so I almost never stop the recording or edit them in between for content. It's just, that's me sitting and talking for a few hours. So the New Discourses Podcast, which you can find wherever you listen to podcasts, if you type in New Discourses and look for the black background with the silver and white brain emblem, newdiscourses.com aggregates them all. YouTube/New Discourses houses them all in video form if you like to consume things that way instead. I am still at Conceptual James on most of the other social media platforms. Obviously, Truth Social has no problem with me. Getter has no problem with me. In fact, they rolled out the red carpet for me on both platforms. Apparently, I have a Gab. I haven't used it. My team aggregates. They've asked me to post actively only personally on one account so that they can aggregate things to other media platforms more efficiently. And so Truth is the one that we've selected for convenience. So I'm only truly active on Truth Social right now, which is not very active. My YouTube account is big. They have not rattled the saber at me. Instagram, I think, any given day might be the last. You never know. So you can follow me at Conceptual James on most of the other social media. And the company is, like I said, New Discourses. Website is newdiscourses.com, and their social media presence is everywhere, and it's at New Discourses. And I don't actually run that account. We did that intentionally in case Twitter shot me down, so we wouldn't have any threats of ban evasion to shut the company down. I've never tweeted to it. I've never logged into it. It's not me. All that's demonstrable if Twitter tried to come after it. So they will publish links to my content and messages about what's going on around me. I will not do my own tweets through them. I don't want to fall. You asked me if the rules of Twitter. I don't actually want to fall afoul of the rule of ban evasion. I don't respect Twitter, but I see no need to do that. So New Discourses is managed by my company, which of course I have oversight of, but it's not me. But I encourage you, if you want my longer form content, written content, and podcast content, to follow it somewhere, because that's where it all gets put out first and all gets put out later. And if you want to find me in person, that's where they tell you where I'm going to be when that is something that is to be known. It's often not, but that's where you can find me for now.
Well, thank you so much, James. And yeah, for all of those who are watching this, James is one of the independent content creators like me. We need your support. So, and James is a very brave person, and he's, I've seen him suffer a lot of harassment and targeted abuse because of him being so steadfast and standing up for shining a light on what these ideologues actually say in their own writings. Okay. Thanks, James.
Thank you, Andy.